So this is the session with the title, What Type of Sustainable Pensions and Savings Mix Does Middle-Income Asia Need? My name is Charles Knox-Vidmanov. I'm a Social Protection Policy Advisor for HelpAge International, based in London, and with the main kind of focus of my work being precisely on this question of what the pension mix should look like. Let me just start by introducing the panel who are with us today. First of all, we have Associate Professor Zhang Danlong, who will be making the main presentation today. As I say, he's an Associate Professor and Director of the Institute of Public Policy and Management at the National Economics University here in Vietnam, and a Senior Researcher at the Institute of Social and Medical Studies in Hanoi. His research interests include the economics of aging, which is, of course, our topic here, and health protection for older people. And he uses actuarial and microsimulation techniques to provide evidence-based policy analysis on those issues. He was involved in the development of Vietnam's social protection strategy from 2011 to 2020, which makes him very qualified to talk about these issues here today. And he's a key member of the task force that's reforming the current social assistance system in Vietnam under Melissa. So we also have Celine Peyron-Bister, who's a Chief Technical Advisor on Social Protection at the International Labour Organization based in Bangkok. Her experience is in the field of social security and social protection at the international level. She joined the ILO in 2001, first with its training centre in Turin, in Italy, and then at the headquarters in Geneva, where she worked, among other issues, on promoting social security for migrant workers. She also worked with the ADB as a social sector specialist in Beijing. And finally, we have Aura Sevilla, who is a project coordinator at the Coalition of Services of the Elderly in the Philippines, and which is a civil society organisation working with and for older people. Aura has led COSE's efforts on improving the country's currently means-tested social pension programme, gathering evidence, advocating for change, with the government networking and building capacity of older people to affect institutional change. With HelpAge, she co-authored a 4-year assessment of the Philippine social pension and is currently working on an assessment of the feasibility of a universal pension. So maybe just to say a few opening words, I think pensions have clearly come up a number of times in the discussion so far. I think it's clearly been recognised that within that mix of income in old age, and in order to provide income security to older people, pensions have a unique and a very important role to play. But I also think there's been some discussion around how pensions aren't necessarily just this form of welfare and a safety net, but they can also have positive impacts on economic performance and on a number of economic issues into the future that are of wider macroeconomic interest. So maybe just to pull out one that I thought came through quite clearly yesterday, I think as Don Hung Park put it, a society where older people can't live a humane, dignified and productive life cannot be considered to be achieving inclusive growth. And I think similarly we've seen a wide range of experience across the world of the important role that pensions play within a social protection system at containing, at reducing inequality, which we see in itself is very important for growth. And maybe another point that I thought came up very clearly for those of you that in the previous session is how when strong pension systems are in place, how they perform quite a strong function of supporting wider family members, that often, a lot of that income, once it's in the hands of older people, is shared, is used to contribute to wider family and household needs. So, the session here, we're really looking at the question of a pension mix that has high coverage, where all older people, I think, would receive some kind of pension, that is adequate, which has a number of different dimensions, and is also sustainable into the long term, and so won't compromise the kind of economic performance of a country. Maybe just to kind of simplistically characterize where I think we are, across this region in terms of that pension mix. I mean, most of the countries here and that are attending the conference have had some form of contributory or work-related pension system in place for often many decades, some reaching back to the 1930s and the 1940s. And many of these have a long history. However, I think one of the key challenges that virtually all of them have faced is in terms of coverage. Most of them still only cover a minority of working people. But here we're talking about middle-income and low-income countries particularly. And in spite of the low coverage, many still struggle with adequacy. Just because you're receiving a contributory pension does not necessarily mean you're even above the poverty line. And similarly, also many are facing issues of sustainability that despite the low coverage, despite the low adequacy, that doesn't necessarily mean that their prospects into the future are one of being sustainable, and many face issues there. So that's a kind of longer-term history I think you see there. Now, something that's a newer development in the region, which I think constitutes that other part of the pension mix, is that in the last 10 to 20 years, a number of countries have started to introduce non-contributory tax finance, or as we call them, social pensions, partly in a response to these issues, the gaps left by the contributory system. So, I mean, just to put that in perspective, I was looking at our HelpAge's social pensions database, where we collate information about different social pensions around the world. And in 1990, really just a handful of countries in the region had a social pension. I think it was Malaysia, Brunei, maybe a couple more. In the last 20 years, at least 14 countries have put in place new schemes, which include many of the countries here, Bangladesh and India, Nepal in the 1990s, Thailand expanding its system quite significantly in the late 2000s. And we have the example of the Philippines here today, of Vietnam. These are all schemes that simply weren't in place 20 years ago. But this said, I think perhaps what we're left with, which is going to be a bit the topic of the discussion today, is we have something of the contributory schemes. We have these new kind of nascent, increasingly expanding social pensions, but often there's a remaining coverage gap, many who aren't covered who kind of fall within the gaps. And similarly, there's not necessarily been much thought, analysis, or progress in actually how do they actually fit together, how do they integrate into the future, and what is a vision for a pension system rather than two slightly dysfunctional components. So that's the question we're focusing on here. And as I say, I think the key themes that cut across that are how to ensure coverage, how to ensure adequacy, and how to do it in a sustainable way. And for specific questions we're looking at, I think as it says in the title, we're looking here particularly at middle-income countries. How can those systems be sustained in the context of demographic change? And what are some of the steps that governments can take to get there? So as with the other panel discussions, we're talking about 20 minutes of presentation from Dr. Long, a little bit of input from the discussants, and then hopefully as much discussion and question and answer from the rest of the audience as possible. So, yes, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Chuck, for kind introduction. And today I will talk about the case of Vietnam. As you can see in the title, the middle income, right? By definition of the World Bank, it will range from 1,000 US dollar per capita to 11,000. So Vietnam, in the case, as low middle income country. So I will try to introduce about the pension system in Vietnam and show whether low middle income country can introduce universal system for older people in the future. My presentation include four parts. The first one, I introduce briefly about the social protection system in Vietnam, so that you can see where the pension system are. And the second one, I will talk about the contributory pension scheme. It means you contribute now, and when you retire, you can get the benefit from the government. And the next one, we can talk about the new system in Vietnam in recent 10 years. That is a non-contributory pension, or sometimes we call social pension. And the last one, as Shark already mentioned, I will show you how to fill the gap in the system for Vietnam so that we can cover all older people in low middle income country like Vietnam. This is a demographic change in Vietnam 2000 and 2050, very briefly, with the United Nations 2014 projection. You can see in 2000, very young, but in 2050, Vietnam will become one of the aged country in the region. You can see the pyramid is not really as before, right? We have more and more older people. This is a social protection system in Vietnam. In general, we have 4 pillars. The first one about labor market, the second one social insurance, the third one will be social assistance, and the last one we call basic social services. And you can see for for contributory pension scheme, it belongs to social insurance. It means you are working, you are contributing, and when you retire, you can get benefit from government. But for the social assistance, we call non-contributory pension scheme, and sometimes we call cash transfer, and sometimes maybe social pension. It means you don't have to pay anything, but you can receive benefit from the government. That is why we have different titles, contributory and non-contributory, in order to distinguish. Let me tell you about the contributory pension system in Vietnam. Sorry for many words, because it is one extracted from the social insurance law in 2014. You can see here we have the contributory pension system designed as pay-as-you-go defined benefit system. It's very popular for the system in the world. And for men, the retirement age about 60 and female about 55, and they need to have 20 years at least for contribution. And contribution rate is very low, actually, in compare with other countries in the region. Only 5% from employee and 10% from employer. And then now, in order to balance the fund, we increase the contribution rate. And by 2016, the total contribution rate is about 22%, compared with about 31% in China, right? And about nearly the same, 30% in Japan, for instance. It's quite high. Quite low in comparison with these two countries. And the replacement rate is really complicated and different between men and female. But we use the average working life benefit for all people. This is a coverage of the contributory pension system. As you can see, we have mandatory scheme, and also we have voluntary scheme. And the last one, you can see S% of the employee. You can see it covers only 22% of the people who are employed now in Vietnam. And compared with the total labor force, just only 22%. So 1/5 of the labor force in Vietnam covered by contributory pension system. By type of ownership, why I have to say so? Because before 1995, we have no private sector to join with the pension scheme in Vietnam. In 1995, we changed and we include private sector people. But if you can see here, you can see that maybe 80% of participants are from public sector, while only 11% from private sector. But in terms of contribution to the labor force, it is inverse. Private sector contribute about 90% of the total labor force, but public sector only 10%. And that is why we have really inverse image of private and public sector in joining with the pension system. This is our projection for the pension fund from 2008 until 2049. You can see the blue one is income, I mean the revenue, and then the red one is expenditure, and the green one is year-end reserve. And according to this one, maybe by 2033, the pension fund will be balanced in terms of income and also expenditure. And then from then, it run 100% on the year-end reserve and will be totally depleted by 2043. Of course, this kind of projection depends on your assumption. But this one, I think, quite similar with the one projected by ILO 3 years ago. For us, the status quo presentation, this one, 2033, we will balance between income and expenditure. But for ILO, it's sooner, 2021, something like that. And we have very different proposal, in order to change the benefit level and also change the retirement age. For this projection, the first one baseline is blue one, as before. I have two proposals. The first one, increase normal retirement age for both men and women. For instance, women will increase their retirement age from 55 to 58, why men will be increased also 3 years from 60 to 63. You can see there increase normal retirement age, NRA. You can see it improve the pension fund, and at the same time, if we increase the contribution rate (CR), you can see also the pension fund balance will improve. But at the end, you can see the king curve. It means definitely at the end they will totally depleted. Maybe the time may be longer, but in any way, revising the normal retirement age or increasing contribution rate, we still have like a depletion of the fund. Let me move to the second part of the pension scheme in Vietnam. That is a non-contributory pension or social pension. This is a milestone for the pension scheme in Vietnam. It was formally introduced in 2007. But before that, in 2000 and 2004, we already have like pilot program to introduce that one to people aged 90 and over with different benefit per month. And from 2007, we reduced the eligible age to 85 and over, and about $7.5 per month for each person. And then in 2010, we revised again by reducing the eligible age and increase the benefit. And in 2013, we keep the same age eligibility, but we increase the benefit level. So it depends on the budget availability of the government. Actually, it's not simple like that. In order to conduct the social pension, we separate older people by two groups. The first one from 60 to 79, and the second one from 80 plus. For 80 plus, we will provide benefit to the people who don't have any retirement benefit or social insurance, right? So anyone will be covered if they don't have any retirement. But for the people aged 60 to 79, we are conducting the so-called mean-tested system, right? With many conditions. For instance, they should be living in poor household without any support from relative, and also they have to live in a public shelter, or they are taken care by the community, for instance. So there are many conditions so that people aged 60 to 79 can receive pension from the government. And the rate, it depends on your situation. You can have different multiplier. So 270,000 is the minimum one. If you are 80 and over and living in poor household, the multiplier will be 2. So it means you have twice of the minimum level, something like that. And by 2013, we have 2.6 million people covered by the system. So it's about 20% of the total older population. So plus contributory pension and non-contributory pension, the whole pension system in Vietnam now cover less than 50% of older people in Vietnam. It means that about 50% of older people in Vietnam are not covered by any kinds of pension. So this is a really critical situation for older people in Vietnam, especially for those who are living in rural area without permanent income and also no cover by social protection system. So by using the map, you can see here how we cover different part of Vietnam for older people. This is a minimum benefit compared to Mauritius. This is I am discussing about the adequacy of the rate for non-contributory pension. You can see here the blue one is showing the rural poverty line. That is a minimum and also very low minimum living standard for Vietnamese people. But you can see the blue line showing the the benefit level. You can see by 2010, the benefit level just about like 45% of the rural poverty line. It means it's really inadequate for people to live at the minimum level, right? So usually government really want to expand the coverage, but because of limited funding, so they try to limit it also the benefit level, because that if we expand the number of people, right, you need to pay more money, and at the same time, if you keep the number of people the same, if you want to increase the benefit level, you also pay more money. So this is a like option for the government. So usually government will try to choose the first one, expand, right? Expand the coverage so that people will satisfy with the coverage of the system. But at the same time, we cannot guarantee about the adequacy of the pension level. My argument is that in the case of Vietnam as a developing country where the administrative system is really bad, I can say, in order to conduct the means tested system, I would argue for universal coverage. And my micro simulation model showing that if we at the same amount of money that government will spend for social pension, we lower benefit, but we have higher coverage, right? So impact on poverty reduction will be better than smaller number of people but higher benefit. And that is why I go, with the argument that we need to expand more and more coverage for older people, and we can keep the benefit level at the certain level with given and also limited funding. And here it is a projection for the budget with universal scheme option. And I think the result here is quite in line with the projection by UNDESA in 2007, right? With $1 per day for one older people. And it maximum say if we cover everyone by 2049, it about 4.5% of GDP in 2049. And if we increase the age eligibility by 75 and over, it only 1.4% of GDP. So that is a menu for government to choose which age you want, and also if you want to increase the benefit level, you have to pay more. And I compare here with the UNDESA 2007, right? So Vietnam, it depends on the group of people government wants to cover. It will range from 0.5 to about 3% of GDP. You can see here. Now, let's look at the social protection for older people in Vietnam, right? You can see here for social pension, right? When we talk about the floor level, it means the minimum level for the people who get the benefit. As I mentioned earlier, now the non-contributory pension benefit just only 45% of the minimum level. So we can see here that is for social pension. Very, very small, and also cover just 20% of older people. But at the same time, for contributory pension, you can see here for the people with high income. Usually they are working for public sector with certain period of time. And that is why we have here, we call missing piece of social protection for older people. Right? We cannot cover people, say, working for the informal sector, right? Or working for household business, for instance. So we have a big gap in this one. So along with my argument about universal coverage, I would propose the design for a system like this one. Okay, we introduce the social pension for everyone, for every older people. But at this one we can use some kind of affluent tax for the people who already have pension or something, right? So we can cover everyone here. And as I mentioned earlier, if you cover all people age 60 and over, the cost by 2049 only 4.5% of GDP, much less now, right? And for this one, you can have like an individual account to have strong link between contribution and also benefit. And if you have more income, you can join with the private pension. So this will be like basic one to maintain the minimum living standard for older people, and then we can add up more and more here. Okay, and the proposal for designing the pension scheme is that we should use the multipolar pension system, and it depends on what kind of group you have. Maybe we have like a 5 pillar like this one. Pillar 0, that is the same as the one I show here. We call social pension, right? And this one, this one will be, social assistance and universal admin tested. But I follow with the universal. And the second one, we will have like public pension plan. And the third one will be the occupational pension. It means you contribute minimum to the government, and then if you have more money, right, you can contribute to the occupational pension. And the third, and the fourth one will be, defined benefit or defined contribution by personal plan. And then the top one will be the personal saving. So you can have your own, income network, right? you already protected by the minimum level by government. If you have more money, you can contribute to the defined benefit or defined contribution from government. And if you have more money, you can have your own, right? Private pension, and then more and more that you can have your own saving, something like that. So it will guarantee you, about the income security. So I would end my presentation here, and thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Long, and perfectly timed to the second, I think, almost. Aura will now share some thoughts. Are you okay to bring out one of the PowerPoints?
Good afternoon, I'm Aura again. So this is actually the topics that I will also discuss is something similar to the Vietnam situation. So in the Philippines, we also have two major systems, which is the contributory and the non-contributory. So the non-contributory, or we call it social pension for the indigent senior citizen, was introduced in 2010. This is in effort of the group of older people who also rally and mobilized with the congressman that time. So the law has been passed. So there are, the government provides 500 pesos for indigent senior citizens, or almost $11, so monthly. So this program provides pension for indigent who is defined as frail, sickly, with disability, with no regular income, and no regular support coming from the family. So very similar with the discussion of Long. So the pension started in limited scope. It started only covering 77 years old and above. It's supposedly 60, but they said the government do not have budget, so we started at 77 years old. So, but eventually the budget went up. From 77 years old, it went just this year, 60 years old. So from 138,000 beneficiaries, this year we have 1.4 million beneficiary. But that is also through the efforts of the older persons lobbying with the congressmen and the government to increase the budget and to fulfill what they have promised to. So we did a review of the 4-year implementation together with Charles. And then we found out that the 500 peso or the $11 is already composed of 30% of household income. So that's relatively a huge income transfer going to this family. So, and on the other hand, it's also have this effect that it increases their high sense of value. And then they feel like they're being taken care of the government, and they feel like they have contributed, and they feel like they don't need to depend on their family. They have their own income. So that's what we found out. On the other hand, the things that we found out is on the targeting system. Because what we see is that the definition is very subjective. One social worker can say, no, this is indigent. The other social worker can say, yes, she is indigent. So there's a lot of problems on definition of indigent. And then another issue is that it's also highly politicized. If you're not good with your mayor or not close to your mayor, there's a tendency that you're not be considered as beneficiary. It happens a lot. And another is there's also a high social cost. I mean, among older persons, they feel like, why this person is included, why I am not? So there's a lot of issues like that. So that's the main issue of the non-contributory pension, which is social pension. On the other hand, we have the contributory system, which we call social security system. This is only for the private employees. So the private, the benefit level is also low. So their benefit is below 80% of the pensioners receive below 5,000. So that's relatively $100 only. So the issue, they cannot go to social pension because the social pension law prohibits anyone to receive, those who are receiving pension, you cannot receive social pension. So they want to have the social pension, but the law simply says, no, you cannot. So, but they said, but contributory pension is something that I contributed for the years. This is what I made up of out of my salary and out of my living. So just to give you a picture, so this is the pensions in the Philippines. So as I told you, this is 2010. So this is the Social Security for private. This is the GSIS for the government employees, and these are the other schemes for judges, for military. So as you can see, they have higher amounts, but there are very few people receiving it. On the other hand, GSIS is also higher. On the average is 8,000, but there are very few. But our biggest pensioners came from SSS, but their average pension is only 3,000. So we have here the social pension. It started small, but now we are covering this much of the population. So what's in the middle is similar to what Dr. Long has shown. So these are those who do not have pension at all. So these are the gap of that. So what's happening now in the Philippines? So this is now what's happening. There's a move to increase SSS by $250 per month. So there's a move to increase this. And then there's another move to increase social pension. Of course, if you increase social pension without increasing SSS, it would cost per base incentives because people have contributed here, but and then people did not contribute, but they get the same rate. You know what I mean? So that's why it would be very difficult if you do that. So, but if you increase SSS and you do nothing with social pension, so it's like giving more to those who already have, or those who have pensions already. So that's the major discussion now happening in the Philippines. So, and then if you would give the SSS this amount, the actuarial study, our pension fund would last until 2042. But if you would give the 2,000 peso everyone this, it would deplete in 11 years. So that would be 2027. So that's one of the problem. That's why we are more proposing for a more universal pension. So if you give, even like Long has mentioned, if you give everyone this a minimum floor, then everyone would have an increase. Everyone would have a top-up, except probably among those who already have increased pensions already, which are very few. So that's what we're moving at. So just to wrap up my discussion, so the reason on this reforms are based on the fact that on equitability and inequity, that you should be providing people who are less than giving them equally the same. So, or people who already have, then give them additional. And another is it's on rights-based. I mean, older people have the rights to have the minimum pension as guaranteed by our International Covenant on Social, Political, Civil, Cultural Rights, and it's stipulated in ILO Recommendation 202. And there's a lot. And then it should also be based that if also you work on targeting, you should also be considering your geographical and administrative capacity of your government. In the Philippines, where shocks is very common, we receive disasters like every now and then. There's no target. The disasters don't target rich and poor. It targets everyone. So we're being affected by these shocks. And then in a country where the administrative is very weak in terms of targeting, I think there's more reasons for you to move towards more universal, because it may move more expensive to the government to do such. So that's what we're working on. And then we also build on the principles that older persons have contributed all their lives. They have contributed for how many years, and then they are still contributing by taking care of their grandchildren and other things. And this support can be not used by only older persons, but the whole family itself. So we're moving towards a family cycle approach, universal social protection, which I think would protect not only older persons from shocks and risk, but the whole family itself. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Now I look really bad because I didn't prepare any slides, so it looks like I didn't do my homework last night. So if you don't mind, I will just pick from the table, and then it's also a way to open quickly the floor for question and answer. It's a bit difficult as being the third speaker to add anything on these two very excellent presentations. A lot has been done with the right messages as well. But maybe I will try to wrap up on these two country experiences and maybe brought it in bringing into a broader perspective. I think what we've been discussing this afternoon is really the two paramount's of any social security system, and for what interests us today is pension system, is finding the right balance between adequacy and sustainability. This was really clearly referred in each presentation. So how much would be an adequate level and how much this will cost and how do we make it sustainable? Adequacy has more an individual or micro dimension, while when we talk about sustainability, and that was really clearly reflected in the presentation for Vietnam, we're more looking at the macro picture, at the sustainability of a system. So really discussing the balance between sustainability and adequacy will reflect a contract, a social contract, an agreement among the society. How much do we think as a society would be an adequate pension, and how much are we ready to pay for it? To pay through contribution, but also to pay through taxes. And this is where the discussion becomes very challenging. And you're all involved in pension reform or work for protection of elderly people in your countries. You know how it's difficult, also because the government comes with different priority. The Ministry of Finance will always tell you that there's no space to expand the level of pension. When we talk about adequacy, during the discussion, we focused a lot on the level of pension, and it was also the case during the presentation this morning and yesterday. But I would just like to remind that adequacy, it's a more broader concept. Adequacy, and this was mentioned also this afternoon, it's adequacy of coverage. We want to make sure that everyone receives at least a minimum pension. So this is the adequacy in terms of coverage, and it was what was represented in the graph of our two countries, extending the population and making sure that we find a solution to fill up this gap. Adequacy, we also often think about level of pension. What should be this level of pension? And this is where pension has a double function. And you discussed it already. It's more like a wrap-up of the discussion. One function is poverty reduction or poverty eradication, because this is now our goal for 2030. And the second function of a pension, it's also replacing income, smoothing consumption. And because these two functions are quite different, the level of pension also that we're ready to offer to the population will be different, depending on the objective we have through the pension system. And maybe this is where we have to think, as Charles said, in a more broader systemic approach. Just to give you a reference, the international standards recommend at least 40% of income replacement, which means that your pension should be at least 40% of your past income through contributory or tax-funded system. Then when we talk about adequacy, we also talk about adequacy in the long term. And this is where you have to think your pension reflecting the increase in the cost of living. So it's important that once you fix the level of your pension, the replacement level of your pension, you also have mechanism to continue reflecting the increase in cost of living. Adequacy, number 4, adequacy also means providing a pension or providing an income replacement throughout the contingency. It seems quite obvious as a comment, but it's not actually what's happening with all pension systems. I'm taking a concrete example. The pension system that provides you with a lump sum at the retirement age, this is an example where it doesn't provide you a pension throughout the contingency. It means until the person or the survivor dies. What we observe very often is this lump sum system is either used to continue paying the education of the grown-up children or used for business and not used in the purpose of a periodical pension that you will receive until your death. And then the last one, and it's according to the ILO, one of the most important when we talk about adequacy. It also means to set up the adequate system. And by this, I mean a system that will look at promoting social solidarity, at promoting redistribution of income among men and women. And pension, it has been demonstrated through many experiences that pension is also a way to redistribute incomes between men and women, because we know that women tend to work more in the informal economy. They have lower wages for similar qualification and similar years of experience in many countries still. Women have also shorter periods of contribution. So a pension system should be designed in a way that you have this kind of redistribution. Also across the sector of the economy, across informal sector, formal sector, across construction sector that requires more temporary workers versus maybe some service sector where you can enter in the enterprise and work all your life in the same enterprise with a good increase of salary. And so those principles are the ones that define a social insurance system. And are very important principle. They are also the principle that the ILO, the International Labour Organization, are defending to make a system sustainable. And when I talk about the ILO, I'm not talking about myself selling Perombista, telling you this is how to set up a system. I'm talking about a representative of the government together with the representative of unions and employers who have decided, who have adopted that those approaches, those 5 points I've just told you, are very important to provide an adequate level of social security or pension in a sustainable manner. And I think those points are still very valid, which also bring my last remark to the fact that setting up a social security system is really a matter of social dialogue. As I started, it's a social contract that has to be decided between what we recognize as being an adequate level and what we are ready to contribute through the workers' and employees' wages, but also through the taxes. When often we hear that there's no taxes available, have we even asked the population whether they will be ready to pay more taxes to also provide better social protection? Have we asked the business sector also if they would prefer to have their workforce better protected through social security system, and in that sense being ready to also pay more taxes? So this is just some more elements to put in the discussion for this afternoon, and I would really like to see more question and answer, and ready to answer to any question.
Brilliant. So thanks very much, Celine. Without further ado, if we could take 3 questions at a time, which seems to be the approach. And maybe starting here. Yes, please, microphones.
Actually, Philip O'Keefe presented this one a couple of times. Actually, last year in Sydney, I was in Sydney, and he compared this, performance of the pension system across all countries in Asia. And he evaluated using the 3 criteria. One is adequacy, and the other coverage and sustainability. And Vietnam is the only country which has all red flag. All this performance. So it's very strange, right? Because if we have a low coverage and low, adequacy, then actually sustainability might be okay. But because of very rapid population aging, and there's a transitory period, Vietnam is the only country which has all problems in adequacy, coverage, and sustainability. So that's just a comment. But let me just echo what she said, the discussant said. it would be nice to have some kind of policy options and show that there are many policy options, because if this is an issue, there are many reforms you can actually do. One is like a parametric reform. Suppose they cut, increase the tax, or you can just the government doesn't have to do anything actually. Then the national debt increases, right? The public debt, and whether that actually the public debt can exceed 80% or 85% in each year, then actually you don't have to say that actually the fund deplete. Actually, in some countries that's one of the options. Another option is, of course, increasing the retirement age. Then actually you have to do something more than just performance. Because the economic implication of pension reform is not about just performance. It's more about indirect effect on labor force participation, whether actually this pension reform actually encourage or discourage labor force participation. Actually, there are only four or five studies in the world. One is in the Masterobani, the Spain, US, and actually Hiroga and I did for Japan. And the countries are so different. Why? Because there is a penalty. If this, whether they can actually retrieve some partial fund, or there is a early penalty for early retrieval, then actually they work more in a way. So there are some studies. Then actually you can cover more about how this pension scheme affect the labor force participation of people. Then actually it'll be, it's just a more, additional dimension, of course. But that's probably the next step you can do. But amazingly, the elasticity is very low in many countries, especially developed countries. In US, there is a study. They increased the retirement age, the pensionable age, by 2 years. And the people actually delay their retirement by 2 months. So elasticity is 0.1. So we cannot just assume that pension reform automatically change their labor force participation. It should be based on study, evidence. Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Let's go gradually around the room. So at the back there. Yeah.
Yeah, just one question, Mr. Long. Even when you were suggesting reform of the pension system, you still had a differential retirement age for men and women. Is there a special reason why you wouldn't have that occasion to have a common retirement age, or is it something that you still think works, that you have a higher retirement age for men and lower for women? Just a question on that. Secondly, just a comment that when you said the government sector employs 10%, but 90% of the contributors to a formal pension scheme come from that sector. But what's coming out in studies now is, though the government sector, whether it includes the military, the government, and I can draw example from South Asia, India, for example, and other countries, where though the percentage of persons employed in the government sector are fewer, the pension burden is quite high because the pension benefits are quite liberal. And contrasting this to the large number of older persons who have no benefits whatsoever, I think increases inequities incredibly. And some of the calculations are, despite the fact that they don't cover the bulk of older persons, still these schemes are not financially sustainable. The question is, if they had covered a wider number, then what would have been the situation? So just that, I think there is a certain inequity which is growing amongst older persons, where you have the favored lot really getting very high liberal pension schemes. I'm not saying that they should be scaled down, but they will create an inequity, and they are getting unsustainable because of very high benefits for government employees who are retiring, and no benefits for other older persons who are not in that sector. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, down here. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for sharing your system here in Vietnam, Philippines as well. I'd like to share also our own system back home in Timor-Leste. We have an universal system, non-contributive, that reaches all the 60 years. They're entitled to have this pension. And also another non-contributive that goes to workers. And at the moment, we don't have a mandatory retirement age. We leave it open, 60 years. If they want to retire, that's fine. So when they reach this age at the moment, because we are working on our contributive scheme, so those, they have, when they retire, those 60 years are non-contributive, they are entitled to have 70% from the government. And we're working on the contributive system at the moment. So I like to hear from all of you. I mean, especially, this, the scheme that we are working on is for private and also public as well. So I just hear from Vietnam, you only do for the private sectors, if I'm not wrong, or otherwise Philippines. Like in Timor-Leste, we are working towards private and also public sector. So if you have any experience, or maybe ILO, because ILO is helping us, what's the best scheme, like we should go for it at the moment. And we are going to debate at the Parliament on the 20th of this month, and this is my 2 members of Parliament, so it will be good if they can hear as well some thoughts from you about the contributive scheme for public and private sector. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. I think there are some comments mixed in with a few kind of specific questions. Long, do you want to start? There was a couple of specifics.
Thank you so much for your very insightful comments and also questions. The first one about the question from Professor Sang Hyop Lee from University of Hawaii. I do agree with you that, some observation from Vietnam, low coverage, low adequacy, why, sometimes we still see the pension fund broken. The thing is, as I mentioned there, the contribution rate is really low in compare with the replacement rate. On average, as I mentioned, the contribution rate is around 22%, but the replacement rate is on average about 55%. So 2.5 times of the contribution. So given you have the same contribution and the same basic salary for calculating the retirement benefit, you broken all the time, for sure, right? And that is why the social insurance law in 2014, we try to revise the calculation for the replacement rate, and now I think the on average the replacement rate is lower than before, and we try to maintain the pension system. But on the other one, I think also very critical that the pension fund investment. The pension fund investment up to now, the reserve fund in Vietnam is about more than 200,000 billion Vietnamese dong, or about 10 billion US dollar. It is the biggest investment fund in Vietnam now. But the problem is about 70% of the pension fund lent to the government budget, right? And you know that in Vietnam, the government budget now is a deficit all the time. And that is why the rate of return on investment of the pension fund really low. And the remaining just, for the big bank in Vietnam to borrow with also lower rate of return than market rate. And actually we can use that kind of very big pension fund to cover for some deficit in the payment. But the problem is that we having the deficit in the both sides, and that is why the image for the pension fund in the future is really like gray along with the aging population. Actually, 2 years ago we did some kind of micro simulation exercise for the whole pension system using and we focus on fiscal space. And it shows that Vietnam, if we remain, status quo, it means we remain everything the same, nothing happen by 2025. It means everything disappear, and we cannot even cover the social pension system. So this is a really critical time for Vietnam to reform, more strongly the system toward, like more sustainable one. Regarding to question from Srinivas from UNDP, I do agree with you. In 2014, we have very big survey about with the people about retirement age, because at that time, before the National Assembly meeting, we try to increase the normal retirement age for women up to 60, the same as men. And then we conduct the survey. more than 60% of them saying that they don't want to extend the normal retirement age for female. They say, oh, we don't need to be equal as men, like 60 years old to be retired. Because they say, okay, the first one, they have health problem. The second one, they have family responsibility. They want to, if they have certain positions, they can continue. But the thing is, majority of them are working in manufacturing sector. They spend a lot of energy already over life. And that is why they want to stay at home to take care of their grandchildren instead of, continuing some kind of physical work until 60, something like that. So that is why we need to respect, labor rather than just provide the law. Yeah, you have to stay in the labor force and retire the same as men. I think that's really inhuman, regulation in that sense. And also the same thing, research with track using the Vietnam National Aging Survey in 2011. 53% of people who already retired, and we asked whether they want to come back with the labor force. They say no because they have health problem. So not only about continuing working in order to maintain the pension fund, but we need to respect their rights. Labor rights. Another one, I think the same as other country. When we talk public sector, actually we always include armed force and military. And you know that they have very special treatment in terms of salary. And some people, they retired at about 46 or 50, right? And they stay healthy until about 80, even 85. So it means they have longer time of receive retirement than the time they work. And that is why we have really trouble with the pension fund when we include the armed force in. But this is a political story. We cannot exclude them. Actually, we propose, okay, we should set up the separate system for military one. But actually, this is a political story. So we still, quote unquote, public sector means including, armed force, right, with very different treatment. The last one. Actually, Vietnam, we started the pension system. We call pay-as-you-go pension system in 1995. So just about 20 years back. And before that, we only have civil servant in the pension system. And the pension system before 1995, we call non-contributory pension because people didn't have to pay anything. And when they retire, they use the last year of working salary as the base for the pension. So everything contributed by the government. But in 1995, we realized the problem of balancing the fund and also balancing the government budget. We try to include first contribution from the public sector. I mean the people who previously as non-contributory, now they have to pay. And the second one, we include very big, private sector. And of course, up to 2014, we have really different treatment between the public and private sector. Usually we have higher replacement rate for public sector than the private sector. For instance, we use the last 5 year or 10 year of salary as the base of retirement benefit for public sector. But at the same time, for private one, we have used the whole contribution life. So usually the basic pension benefit for private sector really low compared to the public one. Even they have the same number of years of contribution. So that is why in 2014, we revised our law of social insurance so that we can have the same base for public and private sector. So I think it's also good experience because you can provide more incentive for the private sector to join with the system. And also at the same time, you really have to chance to formalize the labor market. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, maybe on the question from Timor. Yeah, I agree fully on the question and to what extent we probably haven't measured very well to what extent changing the parameters of pension system will have impact on the labor market. Often what we are able to measure through an economic model doesn't necessarily brings then in the reality what we've expected. And it's also very hard to anticipate how the labor market will react to any pension reform. And the question from Timor on what would work as a pension system, we don't have the answer, except if someone has it here, it will be great, because it will make our life very easy. There's no answer because there's no one model that can be replicated in any other country. I think it's true for social security, it's probably even true for pension system. It really needs to fit the context of the country. Timor-Leste has started with the universal social pension, which is a really great move forward. And I think here, probably the first recommendation, it was also shared by the three person here on the panel, is to think your pension as a system, not to have a dichotomy between your contributory system for public employees, private employees, and then because they don't have anything, let's start a social pension. We have limited resources, so the coverage is limited. I think it's very important to bring around the table the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Social Welfare, the Ministry of Finance, and the other actors as well, the workers and employers, because they will have to contribute to, and to think the pension as a system, and how do we create, as Charles introduced, a multipolar system, where at least everybody, and it was also well illustrated in the slide from Vietnam, I think it was very visual, to see that everybody will receive something, and then according to your capacity to contribute to the system, then you can continue increasing the level of pension. So one recommendation is to think of it as a system that will bring different options, solution, and also to very carefully define your parameters, especially when it's the first time that you're designing your system, to carefully think about the parameters, how much people are ready to contribute, and based on this contribution, how much can be offered. Probably the best way is through an actuarial study that will also do projection in the future, projecting the economic and labor market indicators as well. One of the mistakes sometimes is to make the system attractive. You start with a low contribution, so you're hoping that employers and workers will pay for it, and then you leave the burden of the sustainability issue for the next governments to come. We're starting seeing this in the region, and I mean, this is exactly where Vietnam is struggling now, and the same problem in Thailand. It's only from last year or this year that the system are starting paying the first pension. One of the problem is also the problem in Vietnam is people somehow are disappointed by the level of pension they receive. In Vietnam, one of the issue was people were contributing on the basis of the gross salary, but not their actual salary, which means that, I mean, you have your salary on your pay slip, but in addition to the salary, you have also some allowances, some bonuses, some prime that you will receive on a monthly basis or at the end of the year. So people thought that they will receive 55% of what they were earning last month, but in fact, they were receiving 55% on the salary declared on the pay slip. One issue is which salary reference you will use, which reference salary you will use, and also if you don't have a continuous period of contribution, then your pension will be less than you anticipated. And this is very important because it's part of building the trust in the system. You have to convince people, you have to create incentive for people to contribute to the system. So you need to really carefully decide on your parameters. And my last point is also about the quality of the service. Now you're designing the system, you're thinking about replacement rate, contribution, but also it's important to start thinking about how you're going to deliver the services to the contributors and also services to the beneficiaries. the system has to be simple. It's important to invest also in electronic system that for the employees, it's easy to contribute to the system. For the beneficiary, they can see how much they will receive to create an incentive for them to continue contributing to the system. And here, I often take the example of Mongolia, who is not participating in the conference these days. Mongolia is, we have Mongolia? No. Okay. But you look very young to be receiving a pension. Yeah, and so, Mongolia is one example that I like because, it's true that Mongolia has a small population, 3 million inhabitants now, but Mongolia has a large territory. I don't know how many times Vietnam, but it's huge. But nevertheless, Mongolia has put in place a system that reaches everyone in the country. They have a representative of the social welfare, social insurance at a very decentralized level. And as a result, Mongolia has a universal pension now. And most of it is covered by the contributory system, not even by the tax-funded system. And now Mongolia is talking about the reforming their pension, and really the objective of the next reform is to establish a universal compulsory contributory system. So we're moving, the tax-funded will still be contributing to the first level, the basis level. There will still be a contribution from the state, but because everyone will also be able to contribute to the system, the level of pension will be much higher than just relying on the first pillar of social pension. And one of the reasons that they have more than 70% of the workforce contributing to the system, which is quite an achievement in the region. We know how difficult it is to reach the informal economy, but they have almost 72% now contributing to the system, so they can also offer a higher level of pension. And this was made possible through investing also in the public services, in the delivery mechanism.
Yeah, my point is also similar to what Celine has mentioned, but I just would like to draw some experiences from the Philippines. We have a mix of we have a very fragmented system in the Philippines, pension system. We have 15 pension types in the Philippines. There's a different one for Coast Guard, from Bureau of Jail and Penology. There's also different one for armed forces, for policemen, and then we have the government, we have the private, then we have the contributory and non-contributory. So in short, these are too much system. And then, like Celine has pointed out, it needs to be looked at holistically, and it needs to be looked as one system. And then I hope that our parliamentarians who are here or those who are lobbying for should not look at it in silos. Contributory, non-contributory is a different thing. There should be looked at one as a system and how they could complement each other. Because if you have different systems, the administrative cost is also high. I mean, from the delivery system, from the staff who would maintain that system. I mean, speaking on the experience of the Philippines, that administrative cost can actually be used for benefit itself. So, I'd like to point out that the system should be simple and that every older persons would not be having difficulty getting their pensions, because the problem also, if it's difficult to get and it would cost them too much to get your benefit. In the case of the Philippines, an average of 15% of their pension just goes to their transportation going to the pay points. I think it's making a lot of no sense that they're losing their pensions for their transportation cost. So I think these are just the things that we need to point out when we also speak to our parliamentarians, that these pensions should be looked at as a one system. Yeah.
Okay. We have a slightly awkward amount of time of about 5 to 10 minutes left, which means I think another round of questions with further comments and discussions will take us well into the break, and I think we're quite they need to reorganise the room at the break, so we're slightly restricted. So maybe rather than so much questions, I guess just if anyone for the next kind of 5 minutes has any comments or things they particularly want to share, and then I'll wrap up the session there. Usa, I think is yep.
Thank you. I just want to maybe look at another aspect of pension. In terms of the wider impact of pension, not only cost. Just to want to share some experience from Thailand at HelpAge together with the local partner. We conduct a small-scale research, but looking at how it actually social pension have an impact on local economy. And what we found out is actually about 50% of expenditure is actually used within the community. And that's given indication is that the money that it actually, the pension money spent, it could have a positive impact on local economy, but this only a small scale, but it needs further investigation. But I think most of the time we look at pension as a cost, as expenditure, but whether we should look beyond it and look at the wider impact on development. This is probably not only own age pension, but social protection scheme in general.
Great, thank you also. Does anyone else have any final, or any thoughts, comments, or any questions just to put out there, even if we don't quite have the time to answer them? Oh, yeah, okay, I'll go for Asghar at the back and then Dan here.
That I wasn't able to attend the whole session. Whenever I think of pension inequalities, I always think of two sources of inequalities. One which you could refer to as the upstream factors, where changes will have to happen in the labor market so that people have enough opportunities for employment and savings, and facilitated by, of course, by a pension system, which is a vehicle for people to save for their retirement. But lots of inequalities arising from that entry into the labor market, the wages people receive, the employment experiences. So lots of upstream interventions are required if we want to create an environment in which pension incomes are more equitable. But often talking about this life course phenomenon and early interventions, we forget that we also have the older people who cannot do anything about that aspect of their life. They are now in retirement, living with low income. So one has to also keep arguing for this social assistance type benefits, social pensions. I know HelpAge has done lots of work in that. So one needs to keep these two distinctions in mind whenever thinking about how do we go about creating a more equitable pension outcomes.
Okay, great. And then the final comment just at the front. Brilliant.
Pensions funds, perhaps from Vietnam and Philippines. On the pensions fund, who administers it or who looks after the fund? Is it a private sector or public? And also the pension itself, administratively, who the government or the private sector? Because we have two different. One is to administer, like people that come and have the pension, the database, we have to create it. And the other one is the fund, the pensions fund. I mean, you have to generate more money to be able to, the more money you make, the better for the future, for the pensions, people that have been contribute to the pension. So who does it?
I'm going to give you, whoever wants to respond, 2 to 3 sentences max to respond to that, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, just in the Philippines, because contributory is handled by the government. Non-contributory is handled by the government. Everything is handled by the government, like social security system. It's a different it's a different government agency, and so does the other system. So that's why it's making more complicated, because there are different government agencies handling different pension systems. So that's what we're trying to point out, that there should be only one or two agencies that handling all these pensions, and they should be working together hand in hand, and that so they were missing coverage gap and also better delivery services.
Actually, for Vietnam, for the contributory pension system, we have VSS, Vietnam Social Security. That is a government office. But in terms of investment, it work closely with the Ministry of Finance in investment. And actually, it's not independent agency from the government. So everything decided by the government, and it's just like implementer. But for the non-contributory pension, that is a collaboration between Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs and also Ministry of Finance. And again, Ministry of Finance is the agency that managing the financial issue, but Ministry of Labor is the agency to identify the beneficiary and also manage the beneficiary. Thank you.
I think it's a very legitimate question when you're starting your fund, because during the first 15, 20 years, depends how you will define the system, you will accumulate reserves. And you won't have much expenses, at least for the pension system. So where to put all this money? Vietnam has good experience. Vietnam has this particularity of having the Vietnam Social Security reporting directly to the Prime Minister, not to the Ministry of Labor. Yeah, probably they have the reason for such a setting. Yeah. What is important is you will create a board responsible for supervising the fund's management. What is very important is part of this board, you will have representative of the government, probably also Ministry of Finance, but also to keep representative of the beneficiaries and also those who contribute, the employer sector, if you ask them to contribute. And the second safeguard that you can set up is having periodical actuarial review of your fund. I mean, Vietnam and the Philippines, they do it very regularly. They've also, over the years, developed the capacity to do it themselves, or you can also contract some international institution to do it. And it's important to have those periodical actuarial review and to discuss the result as well with your board and with the beneficiaries for more transparency of the fund.
Great. And just to say, I would encourage you or any other members of the audience, if you have further questions, to follow up with the panel. I mean, just to wrap this up, I mean, a few kind of overarching thoughts from my side. I mean, fiscal sustainability and the kind of coherence, avoiding fragmentation, I mean, those two issues have come up a lot in this session. But one thing that I think strikes me is that actually they're strongly interrelated. I mean, we talk a lot about fiscal sustainability, and we're worried about, things maybe costing too much, though when it comes to actually working out what is too much, it's quite unclear. I mean, if you take the example of social pensions, we have countries like South Africa spending between 1% and 2% of GDP. Vietnam spends a lot less. So does the Philippines. Thailand, 0.5% of GDP. Georgia spends about 4% of GDP, and OECD countries much more. Now, it's not clear which one's got it right and which is the right amount to spend, and it's also not particularly clear that those countries that spend more are somehow heading to some kind of fiscal disaster, whereas those that spend less are all okay. And I think a key point that emerges for me, which Celine highlighted, is affordability is so much a function of politics, and it's a function of a social contract, and it's dependent on that. Now, the reason I think that links to fragmentation is if you have a system that you're spending on, but there's a social contract that is a commitment of government, and that is what, that's what society should be doing. It's a way we protect each other. then I think we can all agree that's a good thing. One of the challenges of fragmentation within these systems, I think, is what you find is mini islands of social security start to build up, which have their own kind of politics. So those in the government scheme are lobbying to get the government scheme higher. Those in the social security scheme are lobbying to get those in the social pension are lobbying, but probably won't do as well because if it's targeted at the poor, they're the least politically well represented. Whereas if we move to a universal system where everyone's effectively playing by similar rules, even though recognizing people's life patterns are going to be different, then I think we get to a much more sustainable system that's based on a long-term political contract. Maybe just another couple of points. I mean, just throughout this conference, we've talked a bit in relation to social pensions about the means testing question. And I think, some of the common things that come up are the administrative costs that are high, especially when targeting the poor. And also the exclusion errors. We know, everyone accepts their exclusion errors. Few people really accept the scale of those errors, which are much higher than most people think. However, when it comes to this question, I think, again, that's slightly missing the point that one of the real challenges of a means testing a social pension in the context of a low coverage contributory pension is you're leaving this missing middle within the pension system. And you're leaving this unanswered question of, okay, one thing happens to the poorest, one thing happens to those in the formal sector, but what happens to those informal sector workers living their lives in a situation of maybe not quite poor, but high levels of insecurity, lack of protection from a whole range of risks, struggling to invest in their own livelihoods and children, and they're kind of somehow left out of the system. Now, for me, what the social pension does is it closes that gap, brings those people in, and hopefully also provides a platform for them to save over time and be brought into the contributory system. And I think I'll leave it at that, apart from maybe saying we talk about coverage, sustainability, adequacy. I think those are the three dimensions we talk a lot about. The one that we've alluded to a little bit, and I think is kind of emerging slightly more prominent over time, is about, I think, quality and something about the quality of administration and service delivery. And that relates to, not having to travel miles and miles and spend a quarter of your pension getting to the pay point. It relates to the quality of service you receive when you receive your pension and accessibility and all these kind of issues. But I think that's another dimension that we could be slightly kind of bringing into the analysis. But anyway, a few thoughts from me. But thank you very much for everyone for coming. And now, yes, time for the break.